So I'm going to cut short my introduction just a little bit. Just to say that, first of all, I think that I am here and share with Benoit this intuition that he had in the desert in Wendover, Utah, which is that the story of the American West might have valuable or instructive tools for thinking about the relationship of art and space here. And so what I'm going to present today is a section that I think might help speak to that intuition. This is a part of a much larger body of writing, and in particular, this is a piece of writing that's surrounded by a study of a work by Michael Heiser that was enacted in 1971, not in the desert, but in an urban surrounding, on the lawn of the Detroit Art Institute in 1971, as I said. This piece was made with bulldozers and drug a 30-ton rock across the lawn until it dug itself into the ground, and then was left there as it was, as you see it. This work, which is the context for the presentation today, was the occasion for much public conflict and misapprehension during its very curtailed public life. It was eventually destroyed by the museum itself before the show was scheduled to end. And this misapprehension and conflict was not only, or not strictly, or maybe not even primarily a matter of its relationship to the public, or the many publics that encountered it, but also to do with the museum that presented it, and as well as figures in the art world who were a little bit bewildered by it, given their understanding of his work in the desert. In particular, there was one curator called Diane Waldman, who was a big advocate of Heiser, but who, in writing about this work, described it as a terrible aggression against the city, a rude disruption of space, an abandonment of order for chaos. I could go on, but her idea was that this was quite distinct in affect, value, and meaning from the works that Heiser had enacted in the desert in the 4 years previously. So referring to crime, physical assault, she recounts someone getting mugged in the parking lot nearby, and the brutality of the suffering in Vietnam, rather mysteriously. She said this sentence, "This is the reality of Detroit, far from the peace of the desert." Now, this formulation, "this is the reality of Detroit, far from the peace of the desert," then gives rise to, this formulation seemed to me to get it exactly wrong. The city and the desert were not opposite things, but indeed bound to one another in the history of American space and rhetorically in the form of the work. And this idea, this very idea of the peace of the desert, as you'll see, seemed to me a complete misapprehension, a contradiction. And where one sees a contradiction, one finds a notch to drive in a wedge as a writer. And I should say that I'm an art historian. I write about art. I'm descriptive and not prescriptive. And so I think I have very little to say about, very little recommendations to make about what art should be produced. But maybe this offers tools for how to think about it critically after it's appeared, in relationship to the space in which it is, in relation to the space or the material strata that it's bound to and grounded in. So with that, I'll head into the writing. If I read too fast, please let me know, okay? And I'll slow it down. So this is section 1, called Under the City. We stand at the southeast corner of West 15th Street in Manhattan on a bright day in 1971. The elevated West Side Highway, built in the 1930s, but by this time nearly obsolete, obstructs our view of the warehouse piers on the Chelsea waterfront to our left. And this is the freeway here, up top. An air of semi-abandonment prevails. Though it is midday, the street seems empty. A few people mark time in Zenith Auto Leasing, while a couple more wait in their cars for a traffic light to change. But there's no urban density or bustle of activity in this post-industrial neighborhood. There's garbage scattered on the streets and building material piled on the sidewalk. A mound of cobblestones, dirt, and paper in the foreground. A stack of planks on the right. Here in the southeast corner of the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, the city grid has begun to fray. This street scene appeared as part of a suite of 5 untitled photographs in the book The New Avant-Garde, Issues for the Art of the 70s. The photographs were taken by the Italian photographer Gianfranco Gorgoni, following instructions from American sculptor Carl Andre. Each picture portrayed, in Andre's words, materials as they happen to have been abandoned in the streets of New York City. A stack of chipped logs and beams fills the rectangle of one photograph, but the others stage more consciously a relation between chaotic piles and their architectural surround. The pictures imply a kind of urban archaeology, rubble mixed in with human leavings, with New York City as a menacing, hazardous massive. Let's go back to the first photograph. So following critic Michael Fried, we might begin with Andre's mastery via Gorgoni's photography of mise en scène. The details of the urban setting in which these heaps of material have found themselves. We observe the stilled traffic in our view and imagine the rapid movement on the highway just above. We see the recession of the urban boulevard on the left as compared to the space on the right, bounded by the Manhattan Industrial Center's massive face. We measure the highway's dark rectangle against the opposite corner's cast shadow and see the relation thereby implied between the opposite corners of this photograph. Massive structure versus disordered pile, grid versus mound. We might imagine ourselves on this site, imagine the sounds, smells, and physical sensations that would occur to someone inhabiting this space. The smell of rubber and oil coming off the highway, the hot pavement. But it's too easy to let this scenography take over. It's too easy to bracket the real confrontation with this ambiguous pile in front of us. Made of granite, these cobblestones are the atomic units of the urban world that surrounds them. Perhaps they've even been pried from the road itself. Behind them, metal slabs have been placed over temporary excavations, access points for the repair of some subterranean system or other. Abandoned like this, pulled from their place in the order of things, this pile of stuff gestures to the materiality of everything in view. The Promethean effort that transformed mere elements into buildings, boulevards, railways, and cities. Uprooted now, subject to the laws of gravity, the stones also suggest that the built order before us might be somewhat less stable than it appears. Indeed, 2 years later, a section of the West Side Highway would collapse under the weight of a dump truck. So imagine a dump truck just falling through right in front of you, precipitating the demolition of the massive structure pictured here. There's also the sense of the city is constituted by a set of contrasts between outsides, cladding, paving, packaging, and the crude material stuff just on the other side of the urban surface. The photographs of 1971 act upon ideas advanced in print by the artist Robert Smithson in his 1967 essay, Towards the Development of an Air Terminal Site. Ideas that would come to be central for the project of earthworks in the years to follow. First is the notion of site selection, which Smithson defined as the investigation of a specific site by extracting concepts out of existing sense data through direct perceptions. The essay was published with two such site selections, photographs of unfinished dam projects in California and Texas. A dam is not a dam, Smithson proposed, until it functions as such. Suspended in process, it's a purely notional construction, or an artwork. Smithson wrote about the Texas site, "If viewed as a discrete stage, it becomes an abstract work of art that vanishes as it develops." The photograph of the excavation below the West Side Highway works in a similar way by suspending the situation's development and marking it as a discrete stage, soon to vanish. Duchampian logic of nomination appears, but if this place is a ready-made, it is also marked as already gone. Alongside site selection was a second idea. This was Smithson's elaboration of the grid networks and crystal systems that now dominated the American landscape. Over the course of the 20th century, Smithson claimed, the landscape of America was overlaid by endlessly regularizing systems of transit and surveying. This abstraction of space takes the form of a crystalline lattice of air traffic control patterns, telecommunications, highways, and borders, an ordered three-dimensional network of vectors and flows superimposed on the geography of America. The very idea of the nation as an image, Smithson contends, is made possible by devices such as the Seacorps aerosurveying satellite, which enables surveyors to tie together land masses separated by more than 200 miles of land, and by the geopolitics of television, which united disparate places through its newly national audience. New modes of travel likewise played a part in creating this national gestalt. The highways built after the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956, I think my image of that has gone missing. Oh. Well, oh. New modes of travel likewise played a part. The highways built after the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956 gave the image of the nation new currency. Space could be traversed ever more efficiently, and commodities transported over interstate highways found their place in the market with renewed speed. These grids colonized new territories for commerce and production, but also unsentimentally discarded older ones, as the André Gorgoni photographs suggest. Amid such momentous transformation, to select a site was to be caught in abstraction and to risk vertigo. Towards the Development also quoted an interview, a very famous interview that gets repeated a lot in relationship to minimalism in earthworks, but it retains, I think, a real sort of incredible air. So I'm just going to repeat it again. He quotes an interview with the sculptor Tony Smith, published at the end of 1966. It describes Smith's nighttime excursion in the early 1950s, so already in retrospect, to explore the unfinished New Jersey Turnpike. His experience with the unmarked blacktop with the sodium lights and fumes of heavy industry hemming the horizon was, he said, a reality that had not had an expression in art. Tony Smith understood it as the end of art. or at least of traditional art practice. And now here's the quote from Tony Smith. "It was a dark night, and there were no lights or shoulder markers, lines or railings, or anything at all, except the dark pavement moving through the landscape of the flats, rimmed by the hills in the distance, but punctuated by stacks, towers, fumes, and colored lights. This drive was a revealing experience. The road and much of the landscape was artificial, and yet it couldn't be called a work of art. On the other hand, it did something for me that art had never done. At first, I didn't know what it was, but its effect was to liberate me from many of the views I had about art. It seemed to me that there had been a reality there that had not had any expression in art. The experience on the road was something mapped out but not socially recognized. I thought to myself, it ought to be clear that that's the end of art. Most painting looks pretty pictorial after that. There is no way you can frame it, you just have to experience it. Later, I discovered some abandoned airstrips in Europe, abandoned works, surrealist landscapes, something that had nothing to do with any function, created worlds without tradition. Artificial landscapes without cultural precedent began to dawn. Artificial landscapes without cultural precedent began to dawn on me. There's a drill ground in Nuremberg large enough to accommodate 2 million men. The entire field is enclosed with high embankments and towers. And here, perplexingly, he ends. Now, ironically, the landscape that Smith understood as the end of art would quickly become the literal site of artistic work. Smithson recounted Smith's story to argue a particularly stunning notion, that the landscape, overlaid by regularizing systems, was better thought as a simulacral terrain than as a real space. Such empty spaces, the unbuilt highway, the abandoned airstrip, the drill ground in Nuremberg, became, in Smithson's imagination, pure construction. Smithson's understanding of the landscape as an ordered lattice of vectors and flows allowed him, following Smith, to imagine works of art as interruptions in a space grid, eruptions of irrationality into a rational synthetic system. Adrian Piper's Utah-Manhattan transfer offers an example of what this might look like, where the artist's simple transposition of squares from one map to another imagines a section of Midtown Manhattan. This is a LeWitt that does some of the same operation, but I'm talking about this work and another like it. So Utah-Manhattan transfer offers examples of what this might look like, where the artist's simple transposition of squares from one map to another, and you can see this is a square of Utah desert here. You see what I'm talking about? Yeah. The simple transposition of squares from one map to another imagines a section of Midtown Manhattan stranded in the salt flats, while a zone of Utah desert erases Times Square and the Garment District. Andres Piles, too, exposed their vaunted city system as a precarious play of surfaces, composed of nothing more special or magical than rocks. But in spaces where synthetic systems had already been interrupted, Smith's drill grounds, for example, art was redundant. If it was art's job to make landscapes surreal, then such artificial landscapes did not need the intervention of art to make them so, thus Smith's end of art. His last example, the drill ground in Nuremberg, shows his hand. These artificial landscapes are not just empty, but phantasmal, nightmarish, places where the fascist human machine was called into being. He was speaking of the specific brand of horror produced by the plan spaces of the 20th century. And then now I move to section 2 on the desert. Okay? Good. So earthworks, as they were articulated in the late 1960s, embodied a contradiction. On the one hand, they were site selections, investigations of a particular place, not least through their capture of existing sense data. On the other hand, earthworks made visible the increasingly abstract systems that administered that site, taking their place as interruptions in a space grid. On the one hand, sense data, site selection. On the other, eruptions into a space grid. Looking at an earthwork, then, entails a peculiar sort of double vision, or dialectical toggling. One moment attending to the place through the senses, as material, as what is here. The next picturing the systems that determined and produced the scene, as one might look at a positive photograph and call to mind the inverted world of its negative. This speaks to how one might look at earthworks, but also to their form, to what ontologically they are. And this is why putting Heiser's earthwork in Voisin can't possibly be the same thing, right? Because it's interacting in a wholly different space grid. It has its own somehow complex history, but it isn't somehow the same. To consolidate another claim, by the 1960s, and I think this squares with what Suzanne was saying about globalization now happening in the countryside. By the 1960s, planned space and abstract systems extended, or at least seemed in the process of extending, everywhere. What would be left were vestiges, exotic remnants of untransformed space. And this may explain why the dream of the American desert looms large in the discourse of earthworks. Nevada, there's a primitivist dimension to some of this work. Nevada is their Tahiti, their ethnographic museum at the Trocadero. And here too we find contradictions. Elaborating them requires a circuit through the history of America's desert imaginaries, before returning to explain how these were enacted and transformed in the earthworks that made the desert their place. And I should say, this is going to offer a sort of pocket history of desert imaginaries. There's going to be a lot of facts here, and they'll come fast. But this, of course, is what site selection beyond sense data demands. Where is this? This is what we would need for Mauvoisin to do the proper job of understanding what a work cited there means. Leave this up for a second. So the discourse on the desert in American thought goes back to the exploration and settlement of the West during the mid-19th century. Zebulon Montgomery Pike, who crossed the plains in 1806, saw the land as an arid waste, comparable to the Sahara Desert in Africa. Tracts of many leagues where not a speck of vegetable matter existed. Major Stephen Harriman Long, who explored the Platte, Arkansas, the Platte, Arkansas, and Red Rivers during the end of the 19th century. Major Stephen Harriman Long, who explored the Platte, Arkansas, and Red Rivers during the early 1920s, called the region the Great American Desert. And this name stuck until the end of the 19th century. The early settlers of the West, who experienced firsthand the hardship of traveling through this desolate landscape, understood it as a harsh and infernal wasteland, a sort of primordial wilderness. The architecture critic Rainer Banham would later argue that this imagining of the desert as a wilderness of sin squared with the Protestant sensibilities and worldview of their settlers. That merciless old-time religion on which I'd been raised was crammed with desert imagery. The desert as the wilderness of sin. This attitude changes, though, around the turn of the 20th century, with the preservationist movement led by John Muir and supported by President Theodore Roosevelt. Muir's goal was to preserve what he saw to be pristine or an untouched wilderness against not just modernization, but also tourism, agriculture, and Native Americans. A scandalous quote, a strangely dirty and irregular life these dark-eyed, dark-haired, half-happy savages lead in this clean wilderness. Here the desert was imagined as a hygienic reservation from the urban and the industrial, a place to avoid pollution or contagion from other people. Again, those are John Muir's words. The hygienic and beautiful are rarely far apart in the American imagination. The other side of Muir's reimagining of the desert appeared in John C. Van Dyke's Naturalist Journal of 1901, a rapturous descriptive account of the Mojave and Colorado deserts and elsewhere. Never mind that all of his descriptions were based on looking out the window of a train car. The days of the hygienic sublime were numbered. As train companies established routes of passage through the American West, a new desert modernity came into view. And with this third moment came a different view of America's desert's uses. In particular, the early 20th century saw an explosion in the scale and ambition of dam projects throughout the West. The water went to support cities and farming on the West Coast, especially Los Angeles and the lucrative industrial farms in the San Fernando Valley. The New Deal saw the Hoover Dam built on the Colorado River, creating Lake Mead, and the Grand Coulee built on the Columbia River, and scores more. These massive endeavors, which are, of course, are earthworks of a kind. Smithson says exactly that this presents a sort of earthwork. These massive endeavors radically transformed the landscape. The desert was no longer a hygienic preserve, an antidote to modernity, but instead a kind of backlot, storage area, and staging ground for cities. This imaginary was further entrenched after World War II, when industries that had devoted themselves to wartime production were forced to turn their advanced technologies back to the American landscape. First, there was a revolution of construction and building materials. Sorry, things are slightly out of order. First, there was a revolution of building materials. It's another Smithson charming collage. King Kong meets the gem of Egypt. First, there was a revolution in construction and building materials, which made home building cheaper and more efficient than ever before. Hundreds of thousands of houses were built in places never before considered: wetlands, hillsides, floodplains, and deserts. New earth-moving equipment, especially the modern bulldozer popularized in the 1930s, and the backhoe, which came into use in 1953, made building that much more effective. Then there was also the construction of the highway system, and here is the familiar. The construction of the highway system in the 1950s, without which the suburban housing boom would never have spread so wide. The modern highway system connected the east and west coasts to such previously difficult to access places as Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. Much of the Nevada and Utah desert remains under the control of the federal government. Nearly 80% of Utah and 86% of Nevada. Land under federal jurisdiction was easily used for military purposes. During World War II, the Army Air Corps established 4 major airfields in Nevada, and the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service relocated its proving ground from the Edgewood Arsenal to Tooele County, Utah, where it was renamed Dugway. In January 1951, the Department of Energy established the Nevada Proving Ground, a 350 square mile area north of Las Vegas. Soon renamed the Nevada test site, it would be used to test nuclear bombs. The United States bombed itself hundreds of times in these years. Today, the Nevada test site is subsumed within the Nellis Air Force Range, which comprises, to quote Richard and Miriam Weissang-Mizrak, comprises the largest ground and airspace available in the Western world for peacetime military operations. An awesome 3 million acre chunk of land and more than 10 million acres of controlled airspace, roughly the size of Switzerland. End quote. Finally, after the uranium frenzy in the 50s and 60s, much of Utah's desert became a dumping ground for radioactive and solid waste of all kinds. Tuella County is home to several Army and commercial facilities for the disposal of solid and hazardous waste. And there are 20 current or proposed Superfund sites in Utah, making it America's dumping ground. Magnesium Corporation on screen, the #1 air polluter in all of North America, makes its home on the western shore of the Great Salt Lake. The West, more than any other American region, was built by state power, state expertise, state technology, and state bureaucracy. Which is to say that this desert is hyper-modern and utterly militarized and utterly urbanized, and not, rather than primordial, an earthwork on a massive scale. The artworks that concern us now enter the story, coinciding with a fourth moment, a popular mania for the American West during the late 1960s. Movies and music, including those on screen, Flying Burrito Brothers and Desert Rock, Two-Lane Blacktop, Terrence Malick's Badlands, Easy Rider. These produced images of the desert as an unregulated and untrammeled wild frontier, the edge of an unsettled, pure, and extreme world. Confronting this myth, Dean McCannell marked this as the moment of the commercialization of the desert, describing the overbearing production of Western trinkets, cactus keychains, authentic Indian blankets. One could buy, any consumer could own their very own piece of the real disappearing West. The very modernity that brought this desert into view was now destroying it. Earth artists took an unironic pleasure in consuming this culture and the trappings of the American West. Robert Smithson ordered a pair of snakeskin cowboy boots while he was in Utah. The receipt is in the archives in the Smithsonian. Walter de Maria pinned a map of Nevada to the wall of his studio in New York. Nancy Holt took pictures of Western graves. The final page of the New Avant-Garde, in the photo essay on Michael Heiser, is a picture of the Las Vegas Strip in 1971. And when the Detroit Institute published Michael Heiser Actual Size, it included opposite a picture of Dissipate, a list of talismanic places, facts, products, flora, and fauna collected on the artist's trips west. And I'll just give you a short example of this litany. Yucca Flat, slot machines, centipedes, herons, Joshua, antimony, hacienda, suicide table, mint, hawks, Herald's Club, uranium, black widows, copper, diatomite, owls, petroglyphs, Caesar's Palace, kinos, sulfur, mountain lions, showboat, tungsten, frontier, cinder cones, gold, tarantulas, diamondbacks, silver, dunes, coral snakes, gypsum, willows, etc., 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 and so on. Ellipses on either side of this litany indicate the potential endlessness of this collection, as well as the outsider's love for the lingo and bare facts of an adopted home. His family was from Nevada, but he'd grown up in Berkeley, California. The march of words speaks as well to a desire to press them against one another, to relish the strangeness of the slide from sulfur, the element, to tungsten, the name of a casino. Heiser exulted at the proximity in desert environs between matter and culture, raw production and commodity exchange. So I'm at the conclusion. What was the desert for these artists? It embodied at different times each of the attitudes I've set out. The wasteland and hygienic reserve, the backlot of modernity, and the staging ground for its deepest myths of independence, wildness, and freedom. In these terms, the peace of the desert was just one myth among many. And these contradictory positions are not resolved in earthworks, even as the practice of earthworks is inseparable from them, inconceivable without them. Earthworks are part of this history, suspended between its double vectors, between the relentless abstraction and regulation of the desert and the equally demanding mythology of the desert's freedom and difference, which came into view in the 1960s and which the culture used so actively. The desert was, most of all, one place, maybe the only place, where the elemental and fundamental were still visible, where cobblestones and well-manicured lawns had not yet covered the earth, where the influence of the cultural apparatus was still partial. It represented a place of freedom from the crowding and constraints of working in urban spaces. Autonomy was secured by moving a supposedly safe distance away. I'm very interested, Suzanne, to talk more about the autochthonic and the autonomous. It's a great idea. Interesting talk later. All of this is not to say that these works were not aware of their contradictory position, or that they didn't ring important changes on these imaginings of the desert. They were aware, and they did change these imaginings. Earthworks were marked by their dream of an elsewhere where some stand against the urban, the social, and maybe even the human could still be made, where some ground of refusal might be found. But this was a dream from which they were always waking up. The reality of the modernized desert was always looming, and they were not unaware of the cliched, fetishistic nature of their investment. And this is visible, I think, in the way that the works seem strangely and maybe unconsciously to mimic or shadow the modalities of the modernity that they intended to evade. Walter de Maria produced designs with the same dry line marker used to map out sports fields, tennis courts, but also to plan bedroom communities. That they were used to draw out the outlines that would be later constructed. De Maria produced designs with the same dry line marker used to plan bedroom communities. Smithson appropriated the bulldozer and backhoe essential to desert development, and Michael Heiser blew crypto craters in the desert floor near bombing ranges. Nancy Holtz, on screen, borrowed in her work the concrete pipes used to build the aqueducts that enabled a hyper-regulated system of water distribution. These technologies of control and planning were diverted to the purposes of art, and their original functions displaced in their new context. For example, no houses are built on Las Vegas Piece, or Desert Cross, or Mile Long Drawing. No shelter is to be found at Double Negative. No water flows through Holt's sun tunnels. The myth of the desert's freedom, that is to say, turned into something else as these artists enacted it. Something impotent. You might think here of Walter de Maria laying inside the lines of Mile Long Drawing, face down. Something impotent, meaninglessly humping the desert floor. something even deathly. So that's where this piece ends. I think I got it in time. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great. That's all.